When you imagine an Arctic voyage in the 18th century, your mind might drift toward images of icy seas, frostbitten sailors, or wooden ships groaning under the pressure of frozen water. Yet behind all of this, the wind in the rigging, the maps unrolled in candlelight, the endless whiteness of snow, there was the constant question of what the men would eat. And so, day after day, expedition after expedition, the survival of Arctic explorers often came down to two ordinary, unglamorous provisions: salted meat and hardtack. Salted meat was no delicacy. It was beef or pork, preserved in heavy brine and packed tightly into wooden barrels. Sometimes whole sides of cattle, sometimes hunks of pork shoulder, all submerged in salt water until the flesh became tough, rubbery, and nearly unrecognisable as food. This method of preservation had been used for centuries, ensuring that meat would last not for days or weeks, but months, even years, as long as the barrels remained sealed and dry. But with time, salt penetrated every fibre, transforming the texture into something that tested the teeth and dulled the appetite. It was food for endurance, not pleasure. Beside it sat hardtack, square, pale biscuits made of nothing more than flour and water, sometimes with a trace of salt. Baked until they resembled tiles more than bread, hardtack had the remarkable quality of resisting rot. Sailors called them molar breakers for their hardness, and when left in storage for months they often became host to weevils or maggots. Yet explorers ate them anyway. The insects were considered little more than extra protein. What mattered was that the biscuit filled the stomach, absorbed water or soup, and gave the illusion of bread in a place where ovens could not exist. In the Arctic, the simple act of chewing such biscuits was an act of survival. Each day the ship's cook would draw from the ship's pantry, really little more than a damp storeroom below deck, and portion out rations for the men. The British Navy, whose standards often set the tone for expeditions in the 18th century, issued a set allowance, usually a pound of salted meat per man per day, accompanied by a pound of biscuit. Sometimes peas or oatmeal would be added, sometimes dried cheese, and occasionally a measure of butter or sweet. Yet on Arctic voyages, fresh provisions quickly disappeared. Vegetables wilted in the cold, fruits froze and split, and flour turned lumpy from moisture. Soon enough, the diet narrowed to its bare bones. Meat and biscuit, biscuit and meat in endless repetition. You can imagine the monotony of it. Morning might begin with a biscuit softened in weak tea or coffee, perhaps crumbled into a thin gruel if there was oatmeal to spare. At midday, a mess of salted beef boiled until the brine leached out, served with more biscuit. At evening, if fortune smiled, a stew with peas or beans, but more often it was the same salted meat reheated, the same hardtack softened, and the same bitter aftertaste that lingered long after the lanterns were dimmed. The body might be sustained, but the spirit grew weary, yet these rations were more than just fuel. They were carefully measured, recorded, and controlled. The purser, responsible for the ship's supplies, kept tallies of every barrel opened, every biscuit distributed. He had to ensure that food would last not just weeks, but perhaps years if resupply was impossible. And so, portions were not generous. A sailor who grumbled at the smallness of his ration might find no sympathy. The logic was harsh but simple. If men ate freely in the first months, there would be nothing left for the final stretch, when ice locked the ship and escape became impossible. Still, salted meat carried its own risks. After months in barrels, the flesh sometimes rotted despite the brine. When a barrel was opened and the stench filled the hold, the sailors knew what awaited them. Meat discoloured, sometimes slimy, sometimes so offensive that even hunger recoiled. But there was no alternative. The cook might boil it several times, skimming off fat and froth, adding whatever spices or onions remained. In the end, the sailors swallowed it down, knowing that protest changed nothing. Hunger and duty overruled disgust. The biscuits told another story. When fresh, they were tolerable, if not pleasant. But by the third or fourth month of a voyage, they were crawling with life. A sailor biting into one might feel the crunch of something that was not flour. Some men tapped their biscuits on the table, shaking out the insects before soaking the remains in tea or broth. Others swallowed them whole, too weary to care. Accounts from journals note the matter-of-fact tone with which men recorded such meals. No outrage, no dramatisation, only the resigned acceptance that this was food enough to keep a body moving across icy decks and frozen landscapes. It is easy now, centuries later, to look back and wonder how men endured. Yet in the 18th century such rations were ordinary. Soldiers ate the same on campaign, sailors the same on tropical voyages, and prisoners the same in workhouses. What made Arctic expeditions different was the extremity of their setting. Cold burned through calories at a merciless rate. Men hauling sledges across ice, climbing rigging in freezing gales, or chopping through frozen water needed more energy than their food could provide. And so, even while eating their daily pound of salted beef and biscuit, they often grew thinner, weaker, more hollow-eyed as the weeks stretched into months. Some expeditions sought to supplement these rations. When possible, crews hunted seals or caught fish, grateful for the taste of fresh flesh and fat. Others tried to barter with indigenous communities, trading cloth, beads, or knives for game or dried meat. These were uncertainties. A ship's commander could never count on such supplies, and so the barrels of salted beef and stacks of hardtack remained, the true foundation of survival. Without them, no voyage could begin. And still, one must ask, could such a diet really sustain life in the frozen north? The records suggest otherwise. Many expeditions reported sickness among the crew, weakness, bleeding gums, and sores that refused to heal. Some blamed the cold, others suspected bad air. Only later would the truth emerge. The absence of fresh vegetables, the vitamin C, made scurvy a constant spectre. Salted meat and hardtack might keep men alive for months, but they could not preserve health for years. And so, in the silent watches of Arctic nights, as men gnawed their biscuits and swallowed their briny meat, a question lingered in every heart. How long could the body endure on such meagre fare before it gave way to illness and despair? You have already seen how barrels of salted beef and stacks of hardtack formed the foundation of the Arctic diet. But to understand the real weight of these rations, you must imagine the daily repetition of them, not just for a week or a month, but for a year or longer. The sameness of meals became a kind of prison, one that worked upon the body as surely as the chains of cold, wind, and ice. Morning began in the dark of the ship's hold, the cold so sharp that men sometimes awoke with frost clinging to their beards. The cook, whose work was never envied, stirred weak porridge or tea, the only warmth available. For this he drew from dwindling supplies of oats, or from the casks of tea leaves brought for morale as much as for sustenance. A sailor would soften his biscuit in this liquid, waiting until the steam loosened its brick-like hardness. The biscuit never became tender, but at least it lost its sharpness, and with enough soaking it could be swallowed without breaking a tooth. For many, this ritual was the only moment of comfort in the day. By midday the cook would produce the main meal, salted beef or pork, boiled until the pot filled with froth and grease. The smell was unmistakable, a mix of salt, smoke, and something metallic. Men received their portion, sometimes with peas or beans if the ship's stores still had them, more often with nothing but biscuit. Those who still had teeth might gnaw through the meat with difficulty. Others, whose gums were swollen or whose teeth had begun to loosen, found themselves unable to chew. They chopped the meat into smaller pieces, boiled it again, and swallowed it as though it were medicine. In truth, it was medicine only for hunger, never for health, and so the cycle repeated. The monotony was not only physical but psychological. Imagine the anticipation of a meal when you already know, with absolute certainty, what it will be. Imagine the sinking of the heart when the cook ladles out a stew that looks identical to yesterday's, and the day before, and the day before that. Even in starvation, variety can bring a spark of hope. But here, in the Arctic, monotony dulled the spirit as surely as frost dulled the fingers. Journals of the time often note this sense of weariness. We dined again on beef and biscuit, and again the men showed little appetite. Appetite did not vanish from satiety, it vanished from despair. Still, sailors found ways to trick themselves into endurance. Some toasted biscuit near the fire, producing a scorched taste that passed for novelty. Others crumbled it into broth, creating a thin soup they called swill or lobscouse. The meat too was disguised. When onions or spices remained, the cook would add them, though by the 4th or 5th month of a voyage, such luxuries were long gone. Occasionally vinegar was distributed to the crew, intended to cut through the monotony and keep scurvy at bay. Men drank it with grimaces, yet they welcomed any change to the endless saltiness of their meals. In such conditions, food took on meaning beyond nourishment. It became a measure of fairness, a sign of leadership, a test of morale. Officers ate much the same as the men, though their portions were sometimes fresher, or their cuts of meat more desirable. When a commander shared equally in the hardships of salted beef and stale biscuit, the men respected him. When an officer hoarded better fare, resentment simmered. And so, meals were not merely personal, they were political. The table, if one can call it that, reflected the order of the ship itself. But even these rituals of fairness could not prevent the creeping arrival of illness. For all the salt in their diet, for all the calories consumed, something essential was missing. Men began to notice small changes. At first, gums bled when teeth were brushed or when biscuit was chewed too roughly. Then the teeth themselves began to loosen, their roots aching in the cold. Old wounds reopened, refusing to heal. Bruises appeared from the slightest bump. Strength seemed to drain away, even though meals were eaten faithfully. The culprit was scurvy, the ancient sailor's curse, brought on by the absence of fresh fruits and vegetables, by the absence of vitamin C. Though no one at a time knew this word or concept, they knew only that without fresh food, men died slowly. Scurvy was not dramatic at its start. It did not come like frostbite, sudden and biting. It crept in, a silent thief of vitality. Men who had once hauled ropes and sledges with vigour now struggled to rise from their hammocks. Their breath grew shallow, their skin yellowish, their joints swollen. The salted meat and hardtack filled the stomach but starved the blood. And though commanders urged their men to eat, though pursers' tallies were kept with diligence, the body's needs went unanswered. Some expeditions tried remedies. Vinegar was distributed, believed to cleanse the body of foul humours. Beer and spruce beer, brewed from pine needles, were experimented with. In later years, citrus juice would prove miraculous, but in the early 18th century this knowledge was still unevenly applied. Thus, many crews remained prisoners of their rations, gnawing biscuit and beef while sickness hollowed them from within. To make matters worse, the sheer cold of the Arctic magnified hunger. Salted beef, though heavy, provided protein and fat, but the labour of sledging across ice consumed more than meals could replace. Men felt hunger even after eating, a gnawing emptiness that no biscuit could quiet. And so the thought of food itself became a torment. Some men dreamed of vegetables, cabbages, carrots, onions, things they once disdained at home but now imagined with desperate longing. Others dreamed of fresh bread, soft and warm, a thing as far away as summer itself. In their journals, sailors wrote with surprising poetry about such dreams. Their bodies were in the Arctic, but their imaginations were back in kitchens and taverns, where meals did not taste of salt and stone. And yet, even amid monotony, small moments of relief arrived. On days when hunting succeeded, when a seal or polar bear was taken, the men rejoiced at the taste of fresh meat. Fat dripped from their fingers, and for the first time in weeks they felt warmth spread through their bellies. But these moments were fleeting, dependent on skill, luck, and weather. The surety of the barrel and the biscuit always returned, the foundations of survival, though survival itself felt like a narrowing circle. It is striking to realise how much of an expedition's fate was determined not by ice or storm, but by what was or was not in the pantry. The strongest ship, the best maps, the bravest crew, all could be undone by diet. And so, the monotony of salted beef and hardtack was not a trivial detail, not a footnote to exploration, but the very line between endurance and collapse. Every bite of meat was both a promise of life and a reminder of mortality. As the months stretched on, men came to measure time not by days or weeks, but by meals. Morning biscuit, midday beef, evening biscuit again. The sameness blurred the calendar. In some journals, explorers even noted that they lost track of dates, remembering only that they had eaten meat yesterday and would eat meat again tomorrow. It was as though life itself became reduced to the cycle of the mess pot and the ration line, as though all the world had shrunk to salt and flour. But what happens to a crew, to its discipline and its spirit, when monotony erodes hope, when scurvy erodes health, when hunger erodes flesh? Does the ship remain orderly, the men obedient, the officers calm? Or does the simple question of food become the spark for mutiny, despair, or collapse? By the time an Arctic expedition had passed through its first winter, the true test of salted meat and hardtack revealed itself. It was not in the opening months, when supplies were still relatively fresh and morale still firm. It was in the long dark, when the sun vanished for months, when ice locked the ship into silence, and when the monotony of food fused with the monotony of endless night. Here, the weaknesses of diet became visible, not as an inconvenience, but as a matter of life and death. One of the earliest and most telling examples came from the voyages of Henry Hudson in the early 17th century. His men, trapped in ice in the Hudson Bay, endured on salted meat and ship's biscuit until mutiny broke out. Journals note the bitterness among the crew, who complained not only of the cold but of the endless sameness of meals. When food turned rancid, when biscuit crumbled with worms, resentment hardened into rebellion. Hudson himself was cast adrift by his starving crew. Though this was a century before the 18th century expeditions we now consider, the pattern was already clear. A ship's fate could hinge as much on its diet as on its charts. In the 18th century the pattern repeated. Consider the voyages of Captain James Cook. Though remembered as one of the most successful navigators of his age, Cook's brilliance was not limited to maps and stars. It extended to food. He introduced sauerkraut and lime juice to his crew, insisting they eat them, even disguising the sour cabbage by serving it first at the officers' table so that sailors would not resist. His ships remained astonishingly free of scurvy, a fact that distinguished him from countless other commanders. Cook's voyages proved that survival was not only about salted beef and biscuit, it was about supplementing them, finding ways to introduce freshness into the diet even in distant seas. Without such foresight, an expedition was vulnerable to collapse. Arctic expeditions, however, often lacked such luxury. The very environment seemed designed to erase the possibility of freshness. Vegetables froze solid and became inedible. Fruit, unless preserved in sugar or alcohol, disintegrated. Hunting could not always be relied upon. And so, even as knowledge of scurvy's cure spread through naval circles, many Arctic crews remained trapped in old patterns. They sailed with barrels of salted beef, stacks of biscuit, and hopes that were stronger than their supplies. The Franklin expedition of 1845, though slightly beyond the 18th century, illustrates the culmination of this tragedy. Sir John Franklin's 2 ships carried tinned provisions, seemingly modern, seemingly reliable, but the food was tainted with lead from poor sealing. Combined with the monotony of rations and the absence of fresh produce, the result was catastrophic. Men weakened, lost their minds, and died in the frozen wilderness. The story has haunted the history of exploration ever since, and at its heart lies the same truth. Diet could doom even the most well-equipped mission. But beyond collapse and death, there were subtler lessons written in the bones of those who endured. Archaeological evidence from burial sites in the Canadian Arctic reveals skeletons with telltale signs of scurvy, porous bone, lesions, fragile joints. Teeth found in graves show lines of wear from years of grinding. Biscuit, even as the gums that once held them, bore marks of disease. These are the silent testimonies of diet, preserved not in ink but in flesh. To study them is to hear the echo of meals eaten in the dark, of salted beef gnawed by weak jaws, of biscuits softened in thin tea. It is history written in the human body itself, and yet amid such bleakness, one must also recognise the resilience of those who survived. Some expeditions endured years in the Arctic and returned home. Their success lay not in the comfort of their food, but in the discipline with which they consumed it. The purser's tallies, the cook's endless boiling, the officer's insistence on fairness. These small rituals held order against the encroaching chaos of ice. A pound of beef and a pound of biscuit might seem meagre, but when shared equally and eaten faithfully, they sustained the fragile line of human will. Without them, exploration would have been impossible. There is a peculiar irony in this history. The Arctic, vast and unknown, was mapped and measured by men whose thoughts were consumed less by geography than by dinner. Diaries from expeditions return again and again to food: what was eaten, how it was prepared, how it tasted, how it failed. One might expect explorers to write of mountains, rivers and stars. Instead, they wrote of biscuits too hard to chew, beef too rotten to stomach, and dreams of fresh bread. Their great adventure was, in the end, a struggle at the table. Today, when one visits maritime museums or reads through old ship logs, the barrels and biscuits seem unremarkable. A slab of salted beef, a dry cracker, hardly the stuff of legend. And yet, these were the true instruments of survival, as important as compass or sextant. The maps drawn in those years would not exist without them. The journals preserved would never have been written. The ships themselves would never have reached their frozen harbours. If history remembers exploration as bold, daring and heroic, it must also remember that such boldness was carried on the back of meat and biscuit in all their salty dullness. For modern ears, this truth carries its own quiet weight. We live in a world of variety, where markets overflow with food from every continent, where freshness is expected, not prized. It is difficult to imagine a life in which the same two foods marked every meal. And yet, this was once ordinary. For the Arctic explorer, monotony was the price of survival. Salted meat and hardtack were not chosen for pleasure, but for endurance. They were history's insurance policy, the dull, reliable companions of those who risked their lives in search of knowledge and glory. And so, the lesson lingers. The Arctic expeditions of the 18th century remind us that survival often depends not on what is extraordinary, but on what is ordinary. The plain foods, the boring staples, the unchanging rations, these are what carried men across frozen seas and brought them home again, if they were fortunate. And they also remind us of the limits of such endurance, of the fragility that comes when the body's denied what it truly needs. For in the end, no amount of salt or flour could erase the shadow of scurvy, or the hollow gnaw of monotony, or the dreams of food that haunted men as much as the ice. So the question remains, what is the true legacy of these rations? Was it their reliability, their quiet service in keeping life alive? Or was it their failure, their inability to sustain health, their silent role in the deaths of countless sailors? Perhaps it is both. Perhaps salted meat and hardtack stand as symbols of human endurance and human limitation alike. Proof that survival can be secured by the most ordinary things, and yet proof too that without knowledge, without balance, even survival itself can become a slow form of defeat. On frozen decks, barrels of citrus rolled gently with the waves, carrying both the sharp scent of survival and the sailors' fragile hopes. For centuries, sailors feared scurvy as much as storms. It was a strange disease, one that seemed to rise out of nowhere, creeping into the bones of strong men and turning them into shadows of themselves. Teeth loosened, gums swelled, old wounds reopened, and joints stiffened until men could scarcely stand. Worse still, no one understood why. Some blamed cold air, others blamed idleness, and still others thought it was caused by bad humours within the body. Whatever the explanation, the fact remained. On long voyages, scurvy killed more sailors than combat or shipwreck combined. In the Arctic, where voyages stretched over years and fresh food was almost impossible to preserve, it became the silent enemy of every expedition. The ordinary rations of salted beef and biscuit described already gave men strength for a time but carried no secret cure. And so, in the 18th century, naval officers and physicians began to search for remedies. Among the candidates was an unlikely fruit, the lemon. For generations, Mediterranean sailors had known that citrus fruit seemed to refresh the body. Some captains noticed that crews who ate oranges or lemons on shore returned to health more quickly than those who ate only meat and bread. But the idea remained anecdotal, scattered among ports and taverns, never codified into naval law. To carry fresh fruit on long voyages seemed foolish. After all, fruit spoiled quickly, and barrels of salted pork lasted for years. Yet, on the edges of the known world, some began to wonder whether fruit might hold the key to survival. The first real test came not in the Arctic, but in warmer seas, when James Lind, a Scottish naval surgeon, conducted what we would now call one of the first clinical trials. In 1747, aboard HMS Salisbury, he divided scurvy-stricken sailors into groups and gave each group a different treatment: vinegar, seawater, cider, elixirs, and citrus. The results were immediate and astonishing. The men given oranges and lemons recovered quickly, while the others worsened. Lind's work, published in 1753, quietly shifted the understanding of scurvy. It was not idleness nor bad air, but something missing in diet, a freshness that only citrus could provide. And yet, even with Lind's results, change came slowly. The navy was vast and tradition-heavy. Officers balked at the cost of shipping lemons and limes, let alone the problem of keeping them fresh. Ships bound for the Arctic often relied on dried or preserved stores, convinced that vinegar, beer, or even sauerkraut might do just as well. Citrus was acknowledged as a cure but not yet embraced as a preventative. In this gap between knowledge and practice, countless sailors continued to die. For Arctic explorers, citrus posed unique challenges. Imagine barrels of lemons or limes stacked on a deck bound for Greenland or Hudson Bay. Within weeks, the fruit would freeze or split and rot, leaving only mush at the bottom of barrels. To prevent this, some commanders tried preserving citrus juice in bottles or casks, but early bottling methods often allowed the juice to ferment or spoil, and the supply lost its power. Sailors would drink sour, flat liquid, convinced they were being cured, while scurvy advanced regardless. It was a cruel irony, medicine at hand, but ineffective by the time it was needed. Nevertheless, some expeditions persisted. In the 1770s, Captain James Cook became the most famous advocate of dietary experimentation. He insisted on carrying not only sauerkraut, but also citrus, molasses, and even malt, distributing them regularly. His success was remarkable. His voyages, which spanned years, reported almost no deaths from scurvy. Cook's methods spread slowly but decisively, influencing later Arctic voyages. Yet even then, the problem of preservation remained unresolved. How to carry citrus into the cold and keep it alive on icy decks was a question that plagued commanders for decades. On Arctic ships, barrels of juice were sometimes stowed near the cook's galley, where warmth might prevent freezing. At other times, bottles were wrapped in cloth and kept in officers' cabins, away from the chill. These measures worked only in part. By the second year of an expedition, juice often turned foul, and so officers rationed it carefully, giving small amounts to men already sick rather than distributing it widely. This practice saved a few, but left the majority vulnerable. The logic was grim but practical. Limited supplies must be spent on those most in need. The taste of citrus, when it did appear, was described in journals with almost reverent joy. After months of salted beef and bitter tea, the sharp sweetness of a lemon slice seemed miraculous. Sailors savoured it, sucking juice from the rind, their faces puckering at the sourness, their bodies aching for more. Some wept, convinced they felt strength return to their limbs. Others clutched bottles of juice like medicine, doling out drops as though they were treasure. In the monotony of Arctic rations, citrus was not just food, it was hope itself. But hope was fragile. On one expedition to Baffin Bay in the late 18th century, barrels of preserved lemon juice were opened after months at sea, only to reveal mould floating on the surface. The disappointment was crushing. Men who had counted on a cure were left to endure biscuit and beef once more. Such stories repeated often enough that commanders began to experiment with alternatives. Spruce beer brewed from pine needles, vinegar taken daily, even portable soup, a kind of gelatin made from boiled bones and vegetables. None worked as reliably as citrus, but each represented the desperate attempt to ward off the invisible hand of scurvy. The search for a reliable source of citrus became as important as the search for new passages of ice. Officers wrote to the Admiralty, begging for improved bottling, for sugar-preserved lemons, for syrups that would last longer. By the close of the century, some improvements had been made. Distilled and sugared juices kept their potency longer, and lime juice became a more common provision. Yet even so, Arctic expeditions remained precarious. Supplies froze, fermented, or simply ran out. The line between health and sickness remained razor-thin, measured in drops of sour liquid poured into a tin cup. And so, by the end of the 18th century, sailors knew two truths at once: that citrus could save them, and that it might not arrive in time. Their lives hung in the fragile space between knowledge and logistics, between barrels of beef and bottles of lemon. They ate their salted rations, they chewed their biscuit, and in the cold hours of the night they wondered, would the next barrel of juice still be good? Would there be enough for all, or only for the dying? Would the cure for scurvy save them or fail them, as it had so many before? By the mid-18th century, the idea that citrus fruit could prevent scurvy had reached the ears of the British Admiralty. Yet in practice, the acceptance of this knowledge was painfully slow. Armies had their traditions and navies had theirs, and tradition is heavy ballast to shift. To carry barrels of salted beef and hard biscuit was expected, natural, the routine of centuries. To carry barrels of fragile fruit or syrup seemed reckless, extravagant, almost fanciful. And so, in the years after James Linn's discoveries, the cure remained more theory than law. The Admiralty debated the matter endlessly. Some argued that lemon juice was too costly, that the expense of importing it from the Mediterranean or West Indies could not be justified. Others worried about spoilage, noting the difficulty of bottling juice without fermentation. Still others dismissed it as a physician's fad, preferring older remedies, vinegar, beer, or simply good ventilation. In the cold world of naval bureaucracy, innovation was slower than ice floes drifting south, and, meanwhile on Arctic voyages sailors continued to eat beef and biscuit until their gums bled. Resistance did not come only from officials. Sailors themselves, bound to their customs and suspicions, often resisted citrus. To many, lemons and limes were foreign fruits, with strange tastes that puckered the mouth. They preferred the familiar bitterness of tea, the warmth of rum, or even the sharp sting of vinegar. Citrus was sometimes seen not as food, but as medicine, and medicine was rarely welcomed by men who already distrusted the officers who commanded them. On some ships, sailors had to be tricked into eating it. Captain James Cook, as noted earlier, became famous not only for carrying citrus and sauerkraut, but for his cleverness in distributing them. He began by serving these foods at the officers' table, allowing common sailors to see their superiors eating them with apparent enjoyment. Curiosity followed, and soon the lower ranks were less resistant. Cook also rotated foods, preventing monotony from souring morale. His success convinced some within the Admiralty, but even then, policy shifted only gradually. It was not until the very end of the century and into the early 19th that lemon juice became an official daily ration in the British Navy. For Arctic expeditions, this shift was both a blessing and a puzzle. The Admiralty might order that every sailor receive an ounce of lemon juice daily, but how to transport it across oceans and into frozen seas? Bottles cracked in the cold, casks leaked, and juice spoiled if exposed to air. Some commanders insisted the juice be mixed with rum or brandy, believing the alcohol would preserve it. Others stirred it into water or tea, distributing it as part of the morning routine. In this way, citrus entered the daily life of the sailor, not as a fruit but as a ritual. The ritual itself was small, yet significant. A line of men gathered with tin cups, the purser or ship's surgeon ladling out measured portions. The liquid was sharp, sour, sometimes sweetened with sugar if supplies allowed. Some drank it eagerly, relishing the burst of flavour against months of salted monotony. Others pinched their noses and swallowed quickly, muttering about doctor's tricks. But all accepted it, for refusal could mean punishment. The Admiralty's orders were clear. Citrus was to be consumed, and commanders were held accountable for ensuring compliance. This daily ritual became part of the rhythm of shipboard life. Just as biscuit was issued at midday and beef boiled for supper, so too was citrus juice poured out each morning. In officers' journals one finds repeated notes. The men received their lime juice. Rarely do these lines elaborate, for the practice became as ordinary as hoisting sails or cleaning decks. But for the men themselves, each sour mouthful carried meaning. It was both a mark of discipline and a token of hope, the knowledge, however faint, that this strange liquid might keep death at bay. Yet problems persisted. Not all citrus was equal. Lemons, rich in vitamin C, were more effective than limes. But by the late 18th century, supply lines from the West Indies made limes more common, and the term lime juice gradually replaced lemon juice in naval vocabulary. Unbeknownst to sailors and officers alike, the lime juice of that era contained far less vitamin C than lemons. Thus, even as the Admiralty congratulated itself on solving scurvy, Arctic expeditions continued to suffer. The irony was cruel. Men drank their mandated ration faithfully, yet sickness spread among them, because the fruit chosen was weaker in the very quality that mattered. Sailors joked darkly about the taste, calling themselves lime juicers, a nickname that clung to British sailors for generations. What began as a sneer turned into a badge of identity. To drink citrus was no longer exotic, no longer suspicious. It became part of what it meant to serve under the British flag. By the turn of the century, to be without it seemed unthinkable. The ritual of citrus had become tradition, as solid as biscuit and beef. On Arctic decks, this tradition took on its own shape. Imagine the scene: men standing in the thin light of a polar morning, ice crusting the rigging, the deck groaning under frozen waves. Each man holds a tin cup while the purser pours out sour liquid, steam rising faintly if it is mixed with hot tea. The liquid is swallowed in silence, followed by grimaces or sighs. Then the cups are stacked, the men disperse, and the daily work begins, hauling sledges, chopping ice, manning watch. The ritual is over in minutes, but it threads through the voyage like a needle through cloth. And yet, beneath the ritual, uncertainty lingered. Did the citrus still hold its power after months in a cask? Did the men drink enough to ward off sickness? Was this daily sourness truly the cure, or was it only another false hope? Journals often carry these doubts. Some commanders expressed confidence, others admitted despair when scurvy returned despite faithful rations. The science of preservation was not yet equal to the knowledge of cure. The cure was known, but it could not always be delivered intact. This gap between knowledge and practice became one of the defining struggles of exploration. Sailors were not undone by ignorance, but by logistics. They knew what they needed, yet could not always carry it safely. It is a peculiar reminder of how fragile survival once was, balanced on the edge of barrels and bottles, measured in ounces of sour liquid. By the close of the 18th century, the ritual of citrus had settled into naval life, yet the Arctic remained stubborn. Men drank their rations, officers logged the issue, and still the disease appeared. The story was not finished. Citrus had entered the decks, but the problem of scurvy remained unresolved. The cure had been found, but its delivery was flawed, so the question remained: could barrels of juice, lined up against the cold, ever truly save a crew? Or would the Arctic swallow the cure as easily as it swallowed ships, leaving behind only bones and unanswered questions? By the dawn of the 19th century, the debate that had lingered for decades finally found resolution. The British Admiralty, having observed the results of Captain Cook's voyages and the mounting evidence from countless naval surgeons, issued firm orders. Lemon juice, and later lime juice, would become a mandatory ration on long voyages. At last, the cure for scurvy was not left to chance, not dependent on the will of individual commanders, but written into the very fabric of naval law. This decision was not purely humanitarian. It was practical, rooted in survival and empire. Scurvy had claimed more sailors than enemy fire. Fleets had been crippled not by battle, but by bleeding gums and swollen joints. To maintain naval supremacy, Britain needed healthy crews, and healthy crews required citrus. Thus, the sour fruit of southern orchards became the unlikely weapon that secured Britain's global reach. On Arctic voyages, however, the cure was never so simple. The challenges of preservation remained. Barrels of juice froze solid in the cold, bottles cracked, and fermentation spoiled supplies. Worse still, the Admiralty's preference for limes over lemons, born of cheaper supply from the West Indies, weakened the very effectiveness of the ration. The irony is striking. The cure for scurvy had been adopted, but in a diluted form. The sailors, faithfully swallowing their daily ounces of lime juice, often received less vitamin C than they needed, and so scurvy continued to haunt expeditions, though its toll was lessened. Still, the ritual became central to naval life. The lime juice ration was issued alongside grog, biscuit, and beef. Sailors lined up with their tin cups, swallowing the sour liquid that had once seemed foreign, but was now as familiar as the creak of the rigging. Over time, resistance faded. What once required trickery or discipline became habit, then tradition, and finally identity. The nickname Limey, first used as a sneer, became shorthand for British sailors everywhere. Citrus had become not only medicine but symbol. For Arctic explorers, the memory of citrus is written in journals with peculiar vividness. After months of salt meat, men recorded their joy at tasting a lemon. One entry, from an officer on an 1820s voyage, describes it simply: "We drank our ration today. The men smiled, some even laughed aloud at the sharpness. It was as though the sun had risen in our mouths. Such small pleasures carried immense weight, lifting morale in the endless night. The ration was not only about health, it was about hope." Yet the failures were not forgotten. The Franklin expedition, though technically of the 19th century, serves as the starkest example. It carried tinned provisions and lime juice, but the tins were tainted with lead, and the juice degraded in quality. Despite compliance with Admiralty rules, the men succumbed to scurvy and starvation. The lesson was bitter. Knowledge alone could not save them if logistics failed. The cure had to be not only known but preserved, delivered and consumed in effective form. In the longer view, citrus reshaped naval culture. It brought discipline to the table, reminding sailors that survival was not just about bravery, but about obedience to daily ritual. The sour swallow each morning became an act of trust. Trust in the officers, in the admiralty, in the unseen science of physicians. It was not exciting, not heroic, but it kept ships afloat, kept men alive, and kept empires supplied with the manpower they required. Looking back, the story of citrus is almost paradoxical. The Arctic, vast and lethal, might be imagined as a theatre of grand heroics. Men facing polar bears, sledging across ice, braving storms. Yet the true battle was fought with ounces of sour juice in tin cups. Survival hinged not on glory but on chemistry, not on bravery but on rations. And in this, the Arctic revealed a truth still relevant today. The greatest dangers are often invisible, and the smallest remedies can carry the weight of empires. For the men themselves, however, the experience was far from abstract. They drank their rations with grimaces, sometimes with gratitude, sometimes with resentment. They recorded its taste in journals, remembered it in letters, and carried its memory home. For those who survived, citrus became a symbol of endurance, a reminder of how close death had come and how strangely it had been held back. For those who did not survive, it is preserved in the archaeology of bones, where signs of scurvy linger despite the efforts of juice. The history of citrus is written both in survival and in failure. Today, when one speaks of limeys, it is easy to forget the weight of that word. It is not merely a nickname, but the echo of centuries of naval struggle against scurvy. It is the echo of barrels stacked on icy decks, of juice rationed in frozen dawns, of men hoping for health in each sour swallow. It is the echo of Arctic expeditions balanced between life and death, their fate carried in the fragile cargo of lemons and limes. And so, the legacy of the lime juice ration stands as both triumph and caution. Triumph, because it represents one of the earliest and most enduring applications of medical science to everyday survival. Caution, because it reminds us how knowledge can falter when misapplied, how even the right cure can fail if delivered in the wrong form. In this tension lies the true history of citrus at sea. When you think of Arctic exploration, you may imagine ice floes and frozen ships, but perhaps the more enduring image is quieter. A sailor, tin cup in hand, standing in the cold, swallowing a mouthful of sour juice while the wind howls through the rigging. A simple act, repeated daily, boring and small, yet in that moment lies the balance of health and sickness, endurance and collapse, discovery and oblivion. The Arctic was mapped not by swords or compasses alone, but by lemons and limes, carried stubbornly across frozen seas. And so the story ends, not with triumph or defeat alone, but with the enduring image of citrus barrels on icy decks, symbols of humanity's struggle to carry fragility into the harshest corners of the world. Beneath endless darkness, meals were lit not by sunlight but by the heavy taste of whale oil and walrus fat, survival's only comfort. When men sailed into the Arctic in the 18th century, they carried with them barrels of salted beef, stacks of biscuit and casks of beer. But the Arctic was not empty. It was a world alive with creatures adapted to the cold, seals, walruses and whales, whose bodies carried reserves of fat thick enough to survive months without food. For the explorers, shivering in wooden ships and gnawing on stale rations, these creatures represented more than just curiosities. They represented survival. The first time a sailor saw a walrus hauled onto the ice, he was struck not by its tusks but by its bulk. Beneath its skin lay inches of fat, a dense, pale substance that could be sliced away in slabs. When boiled or fried, it gave off a strong, oily smell, repellent to some but strangely comforting to others. It was unlike beef or pork, unlike biscuit or pea soup. It was something altogether foreign, yet it held a property their usual food lacked. It was rich in energy, the kind of energy the human body craved in the polar night. Whale blubber, too, carried this quality. Sailors who helped cut open a whale described it as peeling back layers of soft, greasy flesh, glistening even in the cold. The Inuit had long known that such fat, eaten raw or rendered, was essential to survival. It burned brightly in lamps, and it burned just as brightly in the human body. For men weakened by scurvy, thin from hauling sledges, or numbed by the cold, a slice of fat was not just food, but fuel. It warmed from within. At first, European sailors recoiled. fat was not what they considered meat. In London taverns or Portsmouth kitchens, fat was trimmed from cuts, discarded or used sparingly. Here, in the Arctic, fat was unavoidable. It dripped from pans, coated fingers and clung to clothing. It seemed excessive, unclean, almost barbaric. Some resisted it entirely, choosing to gnaw on biscuit rather than swallow the greasy chunks. Others forced it down with grimaces. But slowly, hunger taught its lesson. Fat was survival. Without it, the body withered. Accounts from early expeditions reveal the mixed emotions this food inspired. One sailor described walrus meat as dark and fishy, with a grease that clings to the tongue. Another wrote that after days of salted beef, the fresh oil tasted like a blessing, though it sits heavy upon the stomach. In the monotony of rations, even the strangeness of walrus fat could feel like relief. Freshness mattered more than flavour. The Inuit, watching these strange men from the south struggle with their own food, must have seen the irony. For them, walrus and whale were not last resorts but central pillars of life. Fat was not waste but wealth. They taught that blubber could be eaten raw, sliced thin and swallowed like butter, or boiled into soups rich with energy. They taught that whale oil could be mixed with berries or dried meat, forming a paste that lasted through winter. They knew what explorers were only beginning to learn, that in the Arctic fat is life. Yet not every expedition was willing to learn. Some commanders, clinging to European notions of propriety, forbade their men from consuming what they saw as savage fare. Others allowed it only when supplies of beef ran out. The result was predictable. Men weakened, scurvy spread, and morale collapsed. Meanwhile, those who embraced Arctic fat often fared better. The contrast is visible in journals. Some crews noted constant sickness, others noted surprising strength despite the cold. The difference lay in the willingness to eat what the Arctic offered. Cooking methods shaped acceptance. Boiled walrus fat floating in greasy broth was barely tolerable. Fried, it crisped at the edges and gained something like flavour. Rendered whale oil, poured over biscuit, created a strange, heavy porridge that some men actually preferred to dry bread. In desperate times, fat was eaten raw, its texture soft and slippery, its taste overwhelming. Some gagged, some swallowed in silence, some even learned to enjoy it. Beyond energy, fat carried symbolism. To eat it was to cross a line, to admit dependence on the land and on the people who knew it. For sailors who prided themselves on carrying Europe into the unknown, this was humbling. To survive, they had to abandon some of their prejudices. Fat, once despised, became necessity. It blurred the line between explorer and native, between pride and hunger. But there was also danger. Not all fat was safe. Walrus and seal meat, if undercooked, carried parasites. Whale blubber spoiled quickly in the wrong conditions. Men who ate it carelessly sometimes fell ill, their stomachs rebelling against what they had forced down. Yet these risks were small compared to the certainty of starvation. Better to risk sickness than to face the hollow hunger of a diet too thin for the Arctic's demands. As winter deepened and the sun disappeared, fat took on new importance. In darkness, when men could not hunt or fish, stored blubber became a treasure. It fueled lamps that lit the cabins, and it fueled bodies that hauled sledges across ice. The strip of fat, eaten in silence, could mean the difference between enduring another day and collapsing in the snow. To modern ears, this may sound unappetizing, even grotesque, but to those men, it was as close to warmth as food could offer. So the question arose, whispered in journals and mess tables alike, could Europeans truly adapt to this diet? Could men raised on bread and ale learn to survive on oil and grease? Was survival in the Arctic a matter of courage, or simply a matter of eating what seemed inedible? When Arctic crews found themselves relying on whale oil and walrus fat, the change was never immediate. It crept into daily life, quietly, almost shamefully. At first, fat was treated as a supplement, something to stretch rations of biscuit or to replace meat gone foul. Men might dip bread into rendered oil, not unlike dipping it in gravy back home, though the taste was far from familiar. Over time, the dipping became routine, and the greasy film coating fingers and lips became part of the texture of survival. Cooking with fat required adaptation. Shipboard galleys were built to boil salted beef or bake pea soup, not to render blubber. Yet desperate cooks learned. Chunks of whale blubber were cut into cubes and boiled until they melted into a pool of thick oil. The smell filled the ship, pungent, smoky, clinging to clothes and hair. Sailors complained of the stench, but they ate what was set before them. Walrus fat, fried in pans, spat and popped, until the galley seemed to run with grease. The cook skimmed off oil for lamps and the men consumed the rest. Meals that once seemed alien became normalised through repetition. Routines developed. In the morning, some sailors softened their hardtack in whale oil, swallowing the heavy porridge it became. At midday, fat was boiled with dried peas to form a thick stew, yellow and greasy but filling. In the evening, when cold pressed hardest, men chewed strips of blubber raw, the quickest way to feel warmth spread through their bodies. Journals describe this without drama. The men partook of oil and biscuit. The banality of the entries masks the strangeness of the practice to outsiders. And yet the human mind resists change. Many sailors never accepted the taste. They ate in silence, noses wrinkled, eyes downcast. They muttered that this was not Christian fare. Officers worried that such diets would weaken discipline, that dependence on blubber would reduce morale as surely as scurvy. Some even refused to allow it at first, insisting that men rely on their dwindling stores of beef. But hunger has a way of stripping away prejudice. By the second or third winter, resistance usually collapsed. What had once seemed savage became simply necessary. Still, cultural lines mattered. Among European crews, fat was treated as a last resort. Among Inuit communities, it was central. To eat fat openly without shame was to step closer to Inuit ways of life. This caused tension. Some officers feared accusations of going native, of abandoning European identity. But practical men saw the truth. Those who ate as the Inuit ate lived longer. Gradually, expeditions borrowed more from indigenous practice. Fat was dried, stored, even celebrated when fresh hunts provided it. In this sense, survival softened. Pride and necessity carved away prejudice. The body itself testified to the importance of fat. Sailors on lean rations grew thin quickly in the Arctic. The cold consumed calories mercilessly, pulling energy from every reserve. Men who resisted eating blubber weakened faster, their movements sluggish, their faces hollow. Those who ate fat, however reluctantly, often endured longer, their strength preserved. Officers began to notice the pattern, recording in journals that those who partake freely of oil seem more hearty than those who refuse. In time, fat was no longer shameful, it became medicine. But medicine came with side effects. Overconsumption of whale oil or walrus fat led to stomach cramps, diarrhea, or vomiting. Some men gagged on the slick texture, unable to hold it down. Others developed aversions so strong that they preferred to starve. The balance was delicate. Too little fat and the body withered. Too much, and the body revolted. Survival required moderation, a concept difficult to maintain when hunger gnawed constantly. The result was cycles of feast and sickness, relief and discomfort, all recorded in the dry prose of ship logs. Yet beyond physiology, fat also shaped morale. On days when hunting succeeded and blubber was abundant, men celebrated. The meals, greasy though they were, broke the monotony of beef and biscuit. Spirits lifted, laughter returned, and men spoke of home with more energy. On days when hunts failed, despair deepened. Fat had become more than food. It was a barometer of hope. To see slabs of blubber stacked in the galley was to see the possibility of survival through the long night. To see only empty stores was to feel the weight of death. Practical uses reinforced its centrality. Whale oil fueled lamps that burned through the darkness of the polar night, giving not just light but warmth. The dual role of fat feeding both body and flame made it doubly precious. To eat it was to rob the lamp, to burn it was to rob the stomach. Commanders faced difficult choices: preserve light for work and safety, or feed the men to preserve strength. Often, compromises were struck. Oil rationed carefully, meals measured against hours of lamplight. Survival was a calculation, and fat was its currency. Over time, fat even entered the language of crews. Nicknames arose: blubber eaters, oil men, grease bellies. Some used them as insults, others as badges of pride. Humour softened the hardship. Sailors joked that they would glow in the dark from all the oil they had consumed. They teased one another for the slick shine on their faces after meals. Beneath the laughter lay an unspoken truth. Fat had become inseparable from identity. To endure the Arctic was to become, in some measure, a creature of fat. Yet acceptance never erased longing. Even as men ate blubber, they dreamed of bread, butter, and ale. Journals described vivid fantasies of tavern meals, feasts imagined in the dark. One sailor wrote, "I would give a year's pay for a crust of fresh bread and a pint of milk." Another noted that even rotten apples once spurned at home would be worth their weight in gold. Fat sustained the body but not the imagination. In dreams, men returned to foods of softness and sweetness, far from the harsh grease of survival. In this tension, between necessity and disgust, between fat and fantasy, lay the daily reality of Arctic rations. To survive meant swallowing what seemed unpalatable. To endure meant reshaping identity, abandoning prejudice, and embracing grease. For some, this adaptation brought strength. For others, it brought despair. For all, it brought the recognition that survival was not only about willpower or bravery. It was about the simple, greasy ritual of eating fat in the cold. And so the question lingered on every voyage. Would fat save them, or betray them? Could oil and blubber sustain not only the body but the spirit? Or was this strange diet merely a temporary bargain with the Arctic, one that could not be sustained forever? By the late 18th century, Arctic expeditions had accumulated a peculiar record. Some returned emaciated but alive, while others vanished entirely. The difference often came down not to the strength of their ships or the accuracy of their charts, but to what they put into their mouths. For those who accepted whale oil and walrus fat, survival was possible. For those who resisted, death often followed. Historical journals leave clear contrasts. On one voyage to Hudson Bay in the 1770s, a crew that embraced hunting thrived longer than expected. They boiled seal blubber into stews, fried walrus fat until it crisped, and even ate strips of raw whale skin, rich in vitamin C. Though the men complained of taste, they kept their strength through winter. In their captain's log, the entry is understated. The men appear in tolerable health, though provisions of our own stores run low. Beneath the calm tone lies the truth. Fat had spared them. By contrast, other expeditions refused to adapt. Officers who disdained savage fare kept their men on dwindling supplies of beef and biscuit. When those ran out, starvation and scurvy claimed the crew. One ship, wintering in Baffin Bay, recorded deaths almost daily by the spring thaw. The journals blame cold, ice and illness, but modern historians see another cause, an unwillingness to eat what the Arctic offered. Pride had proven more fatal than frost. The Inuit perspective sheds light on this divide. For millennia, they had lived in the same frozen world, thriving on diets almost entirely of fat and protein. Walrus, seal and whale were not famine foods but staples. Blubber was celebrated, shared and stored with care. The energy it provided was not excess but necessity. To the Inuit, European resistance to fat must have seemed baffling, even foolish. They watched sailors sicken on biscuit and salt pork while fresh, rich food swam beneath the ice. Some tried to teach, offering strips of raw fat to their guests. Some sailors accepted, others recoiled. In those choices lay the line between life and death. Science has since confirmed what Inuit knowledge embodied. Fat carries not only calories but fat-soluble vitamins critical to health. Whale skin and certain fats contain vitamin C, protecting against scurvy in ways salted beef never could. The Inuit were not only surviving, they were thriving on a diet outsiders misunderstood. To borrow their food was to borrow their wisdom, though few expeditions admitted this openly. Pride was easier to record than dependence. The Franklin expedition of 1845, though later than our 18th century focus, became the grim epitaph of this lesson. Franklin's men carried tins of meat and barrels of lime juice, confident in their supplies. Yet the tins were tainted, the lime juice degraded, and the men perished in ice. Inuit testimony recorded that some of the starving crew eventually attempted to eat seal and walrus, but by then it was too late. Their bodies could not recover. The irony is sharp, salvation was all around them in the fat of the Arctic animals, Yet suspicion and delay robbed them of its benefits. For those who survived, fat left indelible memory. Journals describe the smell of boiling blubber clinging to clothing, the slick feel of grease on the tongue, the way meals seemed to coat the stomach for hours. Some wrote of disgust that never faded. Others remembered the relief, even the comfort that came with the heavy warmth spreading after a greasy meal. One officer later recalled, "I thought then, and think still, that the oil of the whale was more precious to me than all the roasts of England." The taste might not have been pleasant, but in memory it became sacred, a symbol of endurance. Archaeology supports these accounts. Excavations at old camps reveal bones of seals and walruses, cut with knives, burned in fires. Traces of oil linger in soil where lamps once burned. The evidence is physical, grease seeped into every corner of survival. To study these sites is to smell the faint echo of oil, to imagine meals eaten in silence while winds howled outside. History is not abstract here, it is greasy, tangible and human. But fat carried more than nourishment. It carried paradox. It saved lives, yet sickened stomachs. It bridged cultures, yet deepened prejudice. It was both despised and revered. To write its history is to see how survival strips away luxury, how necessity rewrites taste. Fat was never chosen. It was endured. Yet endurance itself was enough to map coastlines, to chart ice fields, to bring ships home. Without it, exploration would have ended at the first winter. The legacy of whale oil and walrus fat stretches beyond the Arctic. Whale oil became an international commodity, fueling lamps in Europe and America, lighting cities far from the ice. What began as survival food for explorers became global trade. Yet in the Arctic, its meaning remained more intimate. For the men who ate it, it was the line between another sunrise and an early grave. For the Inuit, it was continuity, the same food their ancestors had eaten, the same that their descendants would eat. For history, it is a reminder that survival often depends on what outsiders dismiss as unthinkable. Today, when you picture the Arctic explorer, you might see a man in furs pulling a sledge across endless white. But perhaps the truer image is smaller. A man crouched over a pot, chewing a strip of greasy fat by lamplight, swallowing against disgust, forcing down what he knows will keep him alive. Exploration was not glorious in that moment. It was greasy, monotonous, and deeply human. And so the story of whale oil and walrus fat ends not with triumph or tragedy alone, but with recognition. These substances, strange to European taste, were the secret threads that stitched survival together. They remind us that endurance is not always noble, nor appetizing, nor remembered in song. Sometimes endurance is simply grease on the tongue, lamps burning through the night, and the quiet acknowledgement that without fat, there is no life in the Arctic. So one final question lingers. Did these men conquer the Arctic, or did the Arctic conquer them, forcing them to abandon taste, pride and custom until they swallowed what they once despised? In the damp hold, ship biscuits waited, hard, stale and riddled with tiny weevils, each bite a reminder of hunger more than nourishment. When you hear the word bread, you likely imagine something soft and fragrant, perhaps fresh from the oven. For sailors of the 18th century, bread meant something altogether different. It meant hard, pale slabs of flour and water, baked until nearly indestructible. This was ship's biscuit, also called hardtack, a food designed not for pleasure, but for endurance. It was baked until every trace of moisture vanished, ensuring that it would not rot during years at sea. It cracked teeth, resisted knives, and when dropped, sometimes rang against the deck like wood. And yet it was the foundation of naval diet, the bread that carried men across oceans and into the Arctic. The process of making ship's biscuit was as unromantic as its taste. In naval dockyards, bakeries were built not to produce loaves for households, but to churn out thousands of biscuits at a time. Workers mixed flour and water into a stiff paste, rolled it flat, and stamped it into uniform squares or rounds. Holes were pricked into the surface to help the heat penetrate evenly. Then the biscuits were baked once, sometimes twice, until they were dry through and through. What emerged from the ovens was closer to ceramic tile than bread. Packed into barrels, they could last for years, at least in theory. But nature is patient. even the driest flour carried tiny passengers, insect eggs invisible to the eye. When biscuits were stored in damp holds or humid climates, these eggs hatched. Out crawled weevils, small beetle-like creatures that chewed through the floury interior, leaving tunnels behind. By the time a barrel was opened on an Arctic voyage, months or years after baking, the biscuits inside were rarely pristine. They were riddled with holes, their surfaces speckled with the faint dust of insect life. Some were so infested that they crumbled in the hand, their interiors crawling. The first time a sailor bit into such a biscuit, the shock must have been sharp. Imagine raising what you think is plain bread to your lips, only to feel the crunch of something alive. Some spat it out in horror. Others, more resigned, kept chewing. Hunger softened resistance. Soon, men learned to tap their biscuits on the table before eating, shaking out whatever crawled within. Weevils scattered across the planks, squirming in the lantern light, to be crushed under boots or ignored altogether. The biscuit itself was eaten anyway. Journals record the matter-of-fact tone of these meals. "Our bread proves foul with insects," one officer wrote, "but the men do not complain, for they hunger." Complaints would have changed nothing. Fresh bread was impossible, ovens could not be maintained on frozen decks, and resupply was a dream far beyond the ice. Biscuits were what they had. Weevils were part of the bargain. Some even joked that the insects provided extra protein, an unappetizing jest that masked resignation. Yet disgust lingered. Sailors spoke of the smell, a faint sourness like old wood. They spoke of the taste, dry, bitter, with a strange sharpness from the insects inside. Some crumbled their biscuit into tea or broth, letting heat drive the creatures to the surface before skimming them away. Others ate in darkness, preferring not to see what they consumed. A few developed rituals. Always break the biscuit in two before biting, always knock it against the table twice, always soak it before chewing. Such routines gave a semblance of control over a situation in which choice was absent. Weevils were not the only intruders. Mites, maggots, and other insects sometimes appeared, depending on where the flour had been milled and how long it had been stored. In tropical voyages, biscuits could be so alive with vermin that barrels seemed to move on their own. In the Arctic, the cold slowed infestations, but it did not erase them. Once eggs had hatched, the creatures persisted, freezing and thawing with the seasons, waiting to crawl again when warmth returned. Despite their flaws, biscuits were considered reliable. They filled the stomach even if half the weight was dust and insect shell. They soaked up oil, vinegar, or tea. They could be crumbled into porridge or ground into flour for puddings. They were versatile in the most basic sense, and most importantly, they were durable. Salted beef might rot, citrus might spoil, fat might go rancid, but biscuit endured. It might be stale, foul, or crawling, but it was always edible. The contrast with fresh bread haunted the imagination. Sailors dreamed of loaves soft enough to tear with fingers, crusts that crackled, crumbs that melted on the tongue. At home, bread was a daily certainty. At sea, it was a fantasy. In the Arctic, that fantasy grew sharper. Men who chewed insect-riddled biscuit in the cold wrote wistfully of bakeries, of markets, of wives and mothers kneading dough. The distance between biscuit and bread was the distance between survival and comfort, between life endured and life lived. And so the stale bread problem was not merely about insects. It was about the erosion of dignity. To eat biscuit was to accept not only hunger but humiliation, the knowledge that one's food was spoiled and that nothing could be done. To shake out weevils before a meal was to acknowledge powerlessness, a small but constant reminder that the Arctic stripped men not only of warmth, but of control. The first encounters with weevils forced crews to ask an uncomfortable question. Was this truly food, or merely fuel? Could a man maintain strength and spirit while eating bread that crawled in his hands? Or would the daily ritual of tapping, crumbling, and swallowing wear down morale as surely as cold wore down flesh? By the second or third month of an Arctic voyage, the novelty of biscuit had already worn thin. What remained was endurance. The daily ritual of opening barrels, handing out rations, and chewing hard lumps that bore little resemblance to bread. Yet the problem was not simply hardness. It was what lived inside the biscuits. The longer they were stored, the more likely they were to be riddled with weevils or mites. their tunnels hollowing the interior like tiny mines. For the sailors who depended on them, this infestation was not a rare event but a daily certainty. The psychological effect cannot be overstated. A man can endure monotony, even hunger, but disgust corrodes the spirit in subtler ways. Imagine the moment of lifting a biscuit from the barrel, brushing away the fine dust of insect remains, and knowing that inside lurked creatures waiting to be chewed. Some men tapped them hard on the table to shake out the living passengers. The sound of biscuits wrapped against planks became part of the ship's music, as common as the creak of rigging or the crash of waves. Others soaked them in water or tea, hoping to drown whatever crawled out. But there was no escaping the truth. The insects were part of the ration. Some journals speak of resignation. "We ate our bread, though it was alive," one sailor noted flatly, "and thought no more of it." Others revealed despair. A midshipman wrote, "The men are much disheartened, for the biscuit is foul and their appetite lessens." Appetite was not a trivial matter. In the cold, men needed to consume vast amounts of calories, and a shrinking appetite threatened survival. To lose the will to eat was as dangerous as frostbite. Thus, commanders often pressed men to swallow their rations, regardless of condition, urging them to ignore the creatures inside. Strategies to disguise the problem multiplied. Some sailors crumbled biscuit into boiling pea soup, letting heat and broth mask the texture. Others fried it in whale oil or fat, the grease disguising the crunch of insects. A common trick was to eat in near darkness, swallowing quickly before the mind had time to rebel. Humour too served as a salve. Men joked that weevils were extra meat, or called them companions of the sea. They laughed that they were never truly alone at dinner, for their bread crawled with company. Such humour was bitter, but it helped transform disgust into something bearable. Officers were not immune. They too received biscuit, though sometimes from barrels set aside for their use. Yet even their stores were not free from infestation. Journals record captains writing with irritation about the poor quality of bread supplied by naval dockyards. The problem, they noted, began before the voyage even left port. Flour was often old, baked into biscuit already harbouring insect eggs. By the time a ship reached the Arctic, the issue was inevitable. Even discipline could not erase it. The toll on morale was subtle but steady. Eating spoiled food is a humiliation, a daily reminder of dependence and powerlessness. For sailors who already lived in cramped frozen quarters, chewing weevil-filled biscuit added insult to injury. The food did not poison them. Most insects were harmless, even edible, but it poisoned the mind. Complaints rose not in the form of mutiny, but in sighs, in loss of cheer, in silence at meals where laughter should have been. Expedition leaders noticed the decline, recording that the men show reluctance at meals, or that spirits sink with the poor quality of bread. And yet what choice was there? There were no bakeries in the Arctic, no ovens for fresh loaves. Attempts to bake on board were usually failures. Flour absorbed dampness, yeast could not rise in the cold, and fires smoked the cabins. Biscuit remained the only viable bread. To discard it would have been madness, and so men ate what they were given, learning to redefine their sense of food. A biscuit crawling with weevils was not spoiled. It was simply ordinary. The boundary between acceptable and unacceptable blurred until survival itself redrew the line. Some sailors even grew indifferent, chewing insects without thought. Hunger dulled disgust. Others, more reflective, recorded the odd sensation of watching fellow men swallow what at home would have been unthinkable. It revealed something about human nature, how quickly necessity erodes taboo, how easily survival reshapes taste. Men who once recoiled at the crunch of a weevil came to shrug and swallow, telling themselves that food was food, that life was life, and that in the Arctic there was no room for delicacy. Yet the question remained, whispered in cabins and written in logs. How long could morale endure when every meal carried such quiet humiliation? Could men remain disciplined, cheerful and obedient when their very bread reminded them of decay? Or did the slow erosion of dignity carry its own hidden cost, one barrel of biscuit at a time? By the end of the 18th century, no naval officer doubted that ship's biscuit was both indispensable and detested. It fed armies and navies, supplied prisons and colonies, and filled the stomachs of explorers from the tropics to the Arctic. Yet its flaws remained impossible to ignore. The same durability that made it essential also made it vulnerable to infestation, and in the tight quarters of Arctic expeditions, where morale was as fragile as the ice beneath their ships, crawling bread could tip the balance between endurance and despair. The consequences were sometimes immediate. On voyages where barrels were opened to reveal swarms of weevils, men resisted eating them, even under threat of punishment. Commanders had to coax, threaten, or cajole their crews into chewing what their instincts rejected. Refusal to eat meant weakness, weakness meant sickness, and sickness spread like frost across a crew. In some cases, logs note sharp declines in health, coinciding with the bread turning foul. Though insects did not cause scurvy, they deepened the despair that allowed it to flourish. The body needs food, but the spirit must accept it. When the spirit recoiled, survival faltered. On other voyages, however, acceptance prevailed. Men grew used to the presence of insects, even indifferent. They joked that the weevils saved on flour, that the bread carried its own meat. Such dark humour disguised resignation, but also revealed resilience. The ability to laugh at crawling biscuit, to treat vermin as companions rather than enemies, was a form of psychological adaptation. Those who could eat without complaint often fared better than those who resisted. Here, as in so many Arctic trials, survival lay not only in the body but in the mind. The symbolic weight of biscuit grew with each expedition. To chew hardtack was to share in a brotherhood of sailors stretching across oceans and generations. Officers recorded it in their logs, not because it was remarkable, but because it was ordinary. The plainness of biscuit, whether fresh or foul, defined naval life as surely as uniforms or discipline. And in the Arctic, where the contrast with imagined loaves of soft bread was sharpest, it came to symbolize endurance itself. To eat biscuit, crawling though it was to declare, "We remain alive." Yet the humiliation lingered. To subsist on vermin-infested food was to confront daily the indifference of bureaucracy. Men knew that the bread had been baked long before in dockyards far away by workers they would never meet. They knew that no one cared whether insects hatched in their rations. They knew that their suffering was not the result of malice but of indifference. This knowledge did not spark mutiny, but it carved quiet bitterness into the soul. The Arctic already stripped men of warmth and comfort. Infested bread stripped them of dignity. Archaeology again confirms what journals describe. Excavations of Arctic camps reveal fragments of biscuit, hardened to stone, preserved by cold. Some bear the telltale tunnels of insects, still visible centuries later. These fragments are small, unimpressive, crumbs of history, and yet they speak loudly. They remind us that exploration was not only about maps and discoveries, but about chewing food unfit for the table. They remind us that survival rested on what others would have thrown away. In memory, biscuit became paradoxical. Some sailors loathed it so deeply that they swore never to eat it again once home. Others spoke of it almost fondly as a marker of shared suffering. One veteran wrote in his old age, "I have eaten much bread in my life, but none so memorable as that which crawled." For him, the memory of infested biscuit was not disgust, but proof of endurance, a symbol of belonging to a fraternity that had faced the Arctic and returned. For modern readers, the stale bread problem may seem trivial compared to storms, ice, or scurvy, but for the men who lived it, it was no small matter. It was daily, constant, inescapable. It was the taste in their mouths, the crunch beneath their teeth, the insects wriggling at their fingertips. It shaped morale, discipline, and imagination. It was the difference between eating and refusing, between surviving and weakening. So the question remains, what does history remember of such meals? Do we recall only the discoveries made, the coastlines charted, the names carved onto maps? Or do we also remember the men hunched in the dim light, tapping biscuits on the table, watching insects scatter, and then chewing anyway? The answer may lie in the very ordinariness of biscuit, its plainness, its infestation, its monotony. These are not grand tales of glory, yet they are the fabric of survival. In the end, the stale bread problem was more than a nuisance. It was a daily test of resilience, a reminder that the Arctic did not only freeze the body, it humiliated the appetite. It forced men to accept what seemed unworthy of consumption and to redefine food as anything that sustained. That lesson, as much as any map or journal, is part of the legacy of exploration. And so, biscuit stands in history as both symbol and burden, It represents endurance, discipline, and the quiet heroism of swallowing disgust. But it also represents the cost of survival, the erosion of dignity, the acceptance of vermin, the swallowing of what should never have been swallowed. It is a symbol not of conquest, but of compromise, of the strange bargains men made with the Arctic to remain alive. So perhaps the final question is this. When survival depends on eating what crawls in your hands, do you emerge stronger or diminished? History offers no easy answer. It only offers the memory of biscuit, stale and infested, yet eaten all the same. Each meal began not with food, but with fire, melting chunks of ice into water, drop by drop, against the silence of frozen seas. To the untrained mind, the Arctic might seem abundant with water. Icebergs drift like floating reservoirs, snow blankets the decks, and every horizon glitters with frozen seas. Yet for sailors in the 18th century, this abundance was deceptive. Fresh water was as scarce as gold. A man could be surrounded by endless ice and snow, but unless it was melted and prepared carefully, he could not drink. The paradox of thirst in a world of water was one of the daily burdens of Arctic expeditions. At the outset of a voyage, ships carried casks of fresh water, filled at ports before departure. These casks were heavy, stored in dark holds, and carefully sealed to prevent spoilage. But no matter how large the supply, it was never enough. Water turned stale within months, tasting of wood, tar, or algae. In some cases, it grew foul, breeding life in its stagnant depths. Sailors, opening a cask, recoiled from the odour, yet drank anyway. A pint of sour water was better than no water at all. But in the Arctic, voyages often stretched far beyond the life of these casks. Snow, then, seemed the obvious solution. Men gathered it by the bucket, shoveling drifts from the deck or hauling it in from shore. Yet snow carried its own problems. Freshly fallen snow could be clean, but snow that sat for days collected soot from lamps, droppings from birds, or salt blown from the sea. Worse still, snow melted into surprisingly little water. A full bucket yielded only a fraction of liquid, forcing constant labour. Men spent hours hauling snow, only to produce a few quarts of drinkable water. In the cold, even this labour drained strength. Ice offered more promise. Blue ice, carved from glaciers or clean flows, was considered the best. It melted clear, crisp, and sweet, a rare luxury compared to the stale taste of cask water. But not all ice was equal. Sea ice, thick and briny, yielded salty liquid unfit to drink. Men who tried soon spat it out, their thirst unsatisfied. Only fresh ice, gathered from river mouths or bergs, could be trusted. Knowing the difference required knowledge, and many expeditions learned through bitter trial. Melting was another obstacle. Fires consumed fuel, and in the Arctic fuel was as scarce as food. Wood could not be spared, and coal was finite. To melt snow and ice, cooks often used the same fires reserved for boiling meat, competing for space and fuel. Pots of snow sat beside pots of beef, filling the galley with a strange mingling of steam and salt. In desperate times, men tried melting snow with whale oil lamps, though the result was pitifully slow. A cup of water after hours of smoky labour. The ritual of melting shaped daily life. Morning began with pots of snow placed on fires, sailors waiting impatiently for enough liquid to brew weak tea or soften. Biscuit. At midday, water was rationed carefully, mixed with vinegar or spirits to disguise taste and kill suspicion of foulness. Evening brought the same process again, men waiting, thirsty, as cooks coaxed water from ice. The process was monotonous, repetitive, and unending. Thirst was never fully quenched, only managed. The body responded with quiet suffering. Lips cracked, throats ached, and urine turned dark from dehydration. Men licked frost from their moustaches, sucked on handfuls of snow despite warnings that it lowered body temperature, or drank brine in moments of desperation. Journals record the calm despair of these acts. The men are sorely afflicted with thirst, one officer wrote, and resort to chewing snow against orders. The line is flat, but behind it lies a scene of men huddled in the cold, chewing ice like animals, their bodies crying out for relief. Water was more than survival, it was discipline. To ration water was to maintain control. Officers measured it in pints, ensuring no man drank more than his share. A sailor caught wasting water faced punishment. Thirst, like hunger, was politicised. A quality of ration mattered, for favouritism bred resentment. To see one man with a fuller cup could spark bitterness, even mutiny. In this sense, water was as much a measure of order as of health. And yet, even in this world of scarcity, men remembered abundance. They dreamed of rivers at home, of wells and rain barrels, of cups filled without thought. To drink freely seemed almost luxurious. In the Arctic, to sip carefully from a tin cup was to taste not only water, but the weight of distance from home. So the question lingered, in a land of endless ice, could men ever truly master their thirst? Or would every sip remind them that survival was borrowed, temporary and fragile, measured in the time it took to melt snow from the deck into a trickle of water? By the second winter of an Arctic voyage, thirst had become a condition of daily life, as constant as cold or hunger. Water was not absent. It surrounded the men in frozen seas and snowdrifts piled high against the ship's hull, but usable water required labour. Every drop meant shoveling, hauling, melting and rationing. The effort consumed hours, shaping routines that became as fixed as the ringing of bells or the turning of watches. Rationing was the foundation of these routines. Officers measured water with meticulous care, recording each man's allowance in logs. A pint a day was common, though in desperate times the amount shrank further. Tea or weak grog was often issued instead of plain water, both to mask stale tastes and to disguise scarcity. A sailor's thirst was rarely quenched in the Arctic. Instead, it was managed, delayed, tricked into submission by flavoured liquids that offered comfort without true satisfaction. The purser, responsible for overseeing supplies, was often the most unpopular man aboard when water ran low. Accusations of favouritism spread quickly, that officers received more, that certain men were favoured, that the purser had miscounted casks. Whether true or not, the suspicion bred resentment. Thirst sharpened every grievance. A quarrel that might have been shrugged off in port became a matter of principle when measured in ounces of water. In this sense, rationing was not only a logistical task but a political act, one that determined the unity of the crew. Sailors themselves sought to supplement their rations through ingenuity. Some chipped blocks of glacier ice when the ship lay near land, carrying them back like treasure. Others scooped snow from crevices, carefully avoiding the upper layers fouled by soot or droppings. When shore parties hunted or scouted, they often returned with ice stuffed into sacks, dragging it over the ice floes as if it were cargo more precious than meat. The best ice was known by its look, blue, clear and dense, ringing like crystal when struck. Such ice yielded sweet water, and men spoke of its taste with near reverence. Not all methods were so clean. Sailors sometimes gathered meltwater from the ship's rigging, licking drops that formed when sun briefly touched the masts. Others scraped frost from bulkheads or canvas sails, swallowing it before it evaporated. These small gestures revealed desperation. A single cup of clear water might be worth hours of labour. In times of scarcity, men risked punishment to steal extra sips from melting pots in the galley, dipping ladles quickly before the cook turned. Yet even ingenuity could not overcome scarcity entirely. Fire remained the bottleneck. Without fuel, ice could not be melted. Expeditions planned carefully, calculating how much coal or wood must be spared for water. But storms, delays, or unexpected winters stretched supplies thin. Men sometimes burned spare timber from the ship itself, prying loose planks to keep fires alive. The irony was sharp. To survive, they consumed the very vessel that carried them. Journals describe these acts in plain terms. We have taken spar and plank for the fire that water might be made. Behind the words lies desperation. The crew watching their ship shrink not from ice but from their own hands. The psychological toll of thirst was quieter than hunger, yet equally corrosive. Hunger produced visible effects: hollow cheeks, weakened muscles, bones pressing against skin. Thirst worked invisibly, drying the mouth, clouding the mind, shortening tempers. Men dreamed not only of bread and meat, but of streams and wells. They spoke of alehouses at home, of pitchers sweating in summer air, of rivers where one could drink freely by the handful. In the Arctic, such dreams became tortures, sharpening the contrast between memory and reality. Some men broke discipline, chewing snow despite orders. Officers warned against it, knowing that the act lowered body temperature and worsened fatigue. Yet temptation was irresistible. Journals note again and again, the men persist in chewing snow. It was not ignorance but desperation. The immediate relief of moisture outweighed the distant risk of chill. In the silence of the polar night, one could hear the crunch of snow between teeth, a quiet defiance of orders, a small rebellion against thirst. Water, like food, also carried symbolism. To share a cup was a sign of solidarity. To withhold one was a mark of betrayal. A commander who shared his ration equally won loyalty, while one who drank more than his men invited hatred. Water was not only liquid, it was justice, fairness, and order, measured each day in ounces. In this way, rationing shaped not only bodies, but the very fabric of discipline. There were moments of relief. When spring thaw came, rivers and streams flowed again, and men drank until they were sick, their bodies unaccustomed to such abundance. The taste of fresh water, clear and cold, was described in journals as the sweetest of all gifts. It was not luxury, it was life returned. Yet such moments were fleeting. Winter always returned, ice closed in, and thirst resumed its quiet work. In the end, the routines of rationing and melting defined Arctic survival as surely as maps and compasses. To be thirsty in a land of ice was not a contradiction. It was the ordinary state of life. And so, sailors asked themselves daily, would the fire hold? Would the casks last? Would the ice yield enough? Could discipline outlast thirst? Or would thirst erode discipline one sip at a time? In the Arctic, thirst rarely killed outright. It did not strike suddenly, like drowning in icy seas, or being crushed by shifting flows. Instead, it gnawed slowly at the margins of strength, wearing down men in ways less visible but equally destructive. Many expeditions that faltered did so not only from hunger or scurvy, but from the relentless scarcity of clean water. The journals and remains they left behind tell this quieter story, of men surrounded by ice yet too weak to melt it, of casks run dry before winter's end, of discipline collapsing under the weight of thirst. One such account comes from an 18th century voyage into Hudson Bay. The crew, trapped in ice, relied first on their casks of stored water. When these turned foul, they turned to snow. But the winter was long, fuel ran low, and men grew reluctant to burn what little wood remained. Melting snow became a chore avoided until desperation forced it. By spring, many had fallen ill, not only from scurvy, but from dehydration that weakened their already failing bodies. The captain's log records the outcome with grim brevity. Many are sick for want of water. The phrase hides the reality of cracked lips, delirium and despair. In other expeditions, the problem was not fuel but ignorance. Some crews attempted to drink from sea ice, not realizing that only certain types were free of salt. They labored to melt thick blocks, only to find the water brackish and undrinkable. In their exhaustion, some swallowed it anyway, worsening their thirst and sickness. Inuit knowledge, had it been heeded, might have spared them. The Inuit knew which ice was safe, where to gather it, how to distinguish fresh from brine. But too often, pride prevented borrowing from this wisdom, and men paid with their health. When expeditions succeeded, water often played a quiet role in their victory. Captains who maintained discipline in rationing, who insisted on daily melting, who prioritized fairness in distribution, these leaders saw their men survive. One officer, writing of a successful return, noted, "We owed our strength to diligence in procuring water. Though it wearied the men, it preserved their health." His words reveal a truth often overlooked. Survival was not merely about courage or fortune, it was about discipline applied to the most basic of needs. Beyond survival, water carried symbolic weight. In journals, men often wrote with surprising poetry about the first sip of fresh water, after months of drinking foul cask liquid or melted snow. They described it as sweet beyond measure, a gift of heaven, the taste of life itself. For men accustomed to scarcity, abundance became overwhelming. Some drank until they vomited, unable to restrain themselves. Others wept quietly, overwhelmed by the memory of rivers and wells at home. These moments remind us that water was not just necessity, but longing, binding men to memories of landscapes far from the ice. The paradox of the Arctic was sharp, to be surrounded by frozen water yet remain thirsty. This paradox etched itself into memory. Sailors who returned alive told stories not only of storms and icebergs, but of snow melted in greasy pots, of foul casks that stank of tar, of endless labour for a cup of water. Their words shaped how future expeditions prepared. More coal was loaded, more barrels reinforced, more attention given to gathering ice early before winter closed in. The lessons were practical, but they were also moral. Survival depended on respecting the ordinary, on valuing water as highly as food or fire. Archaeology confirms these struggles. At abandoned Arctic camps, archaeologists have found scorched stones arranged in circles, evidence of fires used to melt snow. Iron pots, blackened from use, suggest how precious each drop was. In some sites, discarded casks still bear traces of tar and wood, their staves warped by centuries of frost. These remains whisper of men who spent hours each day coaxing water from ice, who measured survival in pints, who died not from lack of courage but from lack of liquid. The legacy of thirst in Arctic exploration lies in its invisibility. Grand histories speak of scurvy, of icebound ships, of daring discoveries. But they rarely linger on the monotony of melting snow, on the taste of sour cask water, on the aching throat of a man who dreamed only of a cup of fresh spring water. Yet for the men who lived it, thirst was as central as hunger. It was daily, constant, inescapable. To ignore it is to miss half the story of survival. And so, when we reflect on Arctic exploration, perhaps we should not imagine only ships trapped in ice, or men hauling sledges. Perhaps we should also imagine smaller scenes. A sailor crouched by a smoking fire waiting for snow to drip into a pot, a crewman chewing ice against orders, lips bleeding from cold, a captain dividing a pint into equal shares, knowing resentment would spark if he faltered. These are not dramatic images, but they are truthful. They are the images of endurance. In the end, the story of water in the Arctic is the story of fragility. Surrounded by ice, men still thirsted. Given barrels, they still ran dry. Armed with discipline, they still faltered. Yet through labour, fairness, and sometimes humility in learning from those who lived there, they endured. The Arctic taught them that survival was not about conquering nature, but about respecting its paradoxes. So the final question lingers. When survival depends on melting snow for every meal, is thirst ever truly quenched? Or does each sip carry with it the memory of scarcity, the knowledge that abundance is temporary, and the quiet fear that tomorrow the pot may be empty? On frozen ground where little grew, pemmican carried the strength of tradition. Dried meat, fat, and berries sustaining weary travellers through endless cold. When European explorers pushed deeper into the Arctic during the 18th century, they carried with them barrels of salted beef, stacks of biscuit, and casks of beer. The same rations that had sustained sailors for centuries. Yet these familiar foods weakened under the weight of Arctic winters. Meat rotted, biscuits crawled with insects, water turned foul, and scurvy crept silently through crews. Survival seemed always on the edge of collapse. It was in this precarious state that Europeans first encountered pemmican. The word itself came from the Cree, but its practice stretched across northern indigenous communities, a mixture of dried meat, rendered fat, and sometimes berries, pounded together into a dense, concentrated food. For the Inuit and others, it was not merely a provision but the backbone of winter survival. It was compact, portable, nourishing, and astonishingly durable. Properly prepared, pemmican could last for years without spoiling, resisting both moisture and cold. For explorers accustomed to barrels of salted beef, the first sight of pemmican must have been strange. It was not cut into neat portions nor packed in brine. It was dark, crumbly, sometimes greasy, carried in bags of hide or stored in lumps. It did not look like European food, nor did it smell like it. Yet when tasted, it revealed its secret. It was dense with energy, richer than biscuit, more sustaining than beef. A few ounces could fuel a man for hours of labour in the snow. The logic of pemmican was simple but profound. Meat, often bison, caribou or deer, was dried in strips, over fire or sun until brittle. It was then pounded into powder or shards. Fat, rendered from the same animal, was poured over and mixed until every fragment was coated. Sometimes berries were added, not for sweetness alone but for their nutrients. The mixture was packed tightly into bags or containers, sealed with more fat to keep out air and moisture. What emerged was a food that embodied efficiency, light enough to carry, durable enough to last years, powerful enough to sustain. The Inuit and Cree had refined this process over generations. They knew the right proportions, the best meats, the ideal fats. They knew how to dry in snow as well as sun, how to protect stores from animals, how to ration carefully. For them, pemmican was not emergency food, it was daily life, the quiet partner of hunting, fishing and travel. European explorers, however, viewed it with suspicion. To men raised on bread and beer, pemmican seemed alien, even crude. Officers sometimes dismissed it as savage fare, unworthy of civilized men. Sailors muttered at its greasiness, its unfamiliar texture, its lack of variety. Yet hunger softened resistance. Once expeditions stretched into months, once salted beef dwindled, once biscuit turned foul, pemmican revealed its power. Crews that accepted it endured. Crews that rejected it faltered. The first recorded British expeditions to adopt pemmican noted its effectiveness with surprise. Journals described men working longer hours, marching greater distances, and suffering less illness when eating it. They remarked at its compactness, how one bag could feed a dozen men for weeks. They compared it to European stores and found their barrels heavy, their biscuits weak, their beef unreliable. Slowly, pemmican began to earn respect, and yet, the act of eating pemmican carried cultural weight. To consume it was to admit dependence on indigenous knowledge, to acknowledge that survival in the Arctic was not simply a matter of European technology, but of borrowed wisdom. Some officers embraced this, praising their native guides and trading eagerly for supplies. Others resisted, clinging to pride even as their men weakened. The difference between humility and arrogance often determined who lived and who died. The taste of pemmican became etched into memory. Sailors wrote of its greasiness, of the way fat coated the mouth, of the heavy satisfaction that followed. Some found it unpleasant, even nauseating when eaten too quickly. Others praised it as the most sustaining food in the world. Its flavour may not have been beloved, but its effect was undeniable. Warmth returned to limbs, energy flowed back into weary bodies, and the endless labour of Arctic travel became possible again. The first encounters with pemmican, then, were more than culinary. They were cultural encounters, moments when survival hinged on whether men could abandon prejudice and accept food outside their traditions. For some, pemmican was salvation. For others, it was a step too far. And so, a question formed, lingering in journals and in the silence of frozen camps. Could Europeans truly survive the Arctic without learning to eat as the Inuit did? Or was pemmican not just an option, but the only bridge between exploration and extinction? Once pemmican had been tasted and tested, it rarely left an expedition unchanged. At first, it appeared as an emergency food, acquired in small amounts from Inuit hunters, or traded with Cree trappers at posts along northern rivers. But soon, its efficiency revealed itself so plainly that some commanders made it central to their planning. Yet to make pemmican part of routine life aboard ship or in camp was not simply a matter of provisioning. It was a negotiation of culture, hierarchy and pride. Trade was the first step. Explorers could not produce pemmican on their own in any meaningful quantity. They lacked the herds, the knowledge of preparation, and the patience to follow each step correctly. They depended on indigenous communities who had perfected the craft. Furs, beads, knives and cloth were exchanged for sacks of pemmican, which were often carried on sledges or hauled by dogs. In this exchange, power shifted subtly. The Europeans, who prided themselves on bringing technology to the Arctic, now found themselves reliant on indigenous food to keep their men alive. This reliance sometimes bred gratitude, sometimes resentment. Grateful commanders praised the ingenuity of pemmican, noting in their logs that, without the assistance of the natives, we should have perished. Resentful ones downplayed their dependence, writing of pemmican as if it were a curiosity rather than a lifeline. Yet whether admitted or not, the truth remained. Pemmican was often the difference between endurance and collapse. Daily routines soon adapted. Pemmican was portable, which made it ideal for sledging parties and scouting expeditions. Men carried lumps wrapped in hide or cloth, eating them raw or crumbled into boiling water to form a greasy stew. Some added biscuit crumbs or dried peas when available, thickening the mixture into what they called pemmican hash. The taste was heavy, oily, and monotonous, but the effect was profound. Men noted that it sustained them through long marches, warming them from within and lessening fatigue. It was fuel in the truest sense, compact, efficient, and reliable. Officers learned to ration it carefully. A small portion of pemmican could equal a pound of beef in sustaining power, which meant that sacks lasted longer than barrels of meat. Yet this also raised tensions. Men accustomed to large meals of beef struggled to accept that a smaller, greasier lump was sufficient. Some accused their superiors of stinginess, not realising that pemmican was designed to be eaten sparingly. Misunderstandings over portions sometimes sparked quarrels, reflecting the deeper challenge of adapting not only stomachs, but expectations. The politics of pemmican extended beyond rations. By the early 19th century, as Arctic expeditions increased, the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, fur trading giants, began to depend on pemmican as much as explorers did. It became the fuel of commerce, sustaining voyageurs who carried furs by canoe across Canada. Conflicts even arose over its control, culminating in what historians now call the Pemmican War of 1814 to 1821, when rival traders fought over access to this essential provision. Though this occurred slightly later than our Arctic focus, it reveals the scale of pemmican's importance. What began as indigenous survival food became the foundation of empire building in the north. For Arctic crews, pemmican also reshaped relations with indigenous allies. To accept pemmican was to accept dependence. This was not always easy for officers who considered themselves emissaries of superior civilizations. Some recorded their discomfort bluntly, noting that they disliked stooping to eat savage fare. Yet even as they wrote such words, they continued to trade, continued to eat, continued to survive on the food they scorned. The contradiction ran deep. Survival blurred the lines between pride and humility, forcing men to borrow knowledge they could not acknowledge fully. Among sailors, attitudes varied. Some took to pemmican readily, praising its warmth and energy. Others despised its greasiness, complaining of stomach aches or nausea when eating too much. Discipline sometimes faltered over the issue, men refusing to eat their portion and demanding biscuit instead. Officers, knowing the stakes, forced compliance, reminding crews that biscuit could not last and pemmican was their only hope. In this way, pemmican became not only food, but discipline, a test of obedience as much as of appetite. Over time, the routine normalised. Pemmican was boiled into stews morning and evening, eaten raw on marches, packed for sledging trips, and distributed in careful measures. Men came to expect its heavy taste, its greasy feel, its reliable strength. It became part of the soundscape of survival. The chopping of dried meat, the rendering of fat, the slosh of greasy stew in a tin bowl. In journals, mentions of pemmican moved from curiosity to banality, evidence that what was once strange had become ordinary. Yet beneath this ordinariness, tensions lingered. Was pemmican merely a temporary concession to necessity, or did it represent a deeper truth? That European methods alone could not master the Arctic? Some commanders feared the latter, fearing that too much reliance on indigenous knowledge undermined their authority. Others embraced it, seeing in pemmican proof that survival required humility. These attitudes shaped not only expeditions, but also the narratives written afterward. Some histories praised indigenous contributions openly, others erased them, presenting survival as if it had been achieved by European ingenuity alone. For the men who lived it, however, there was no question. Pemmican was not a choice, not a symbol, not a debate. It was simply food that kept them alive when nothing else could. And so, in the dark of the Arctic night, men chewed greasy lumps of dried meat and fat, grateful for its strength, resentful of its taste, and resigned to its necessity. But a question still hovered in their minds. Could pemmican, however efficient, truly replace the foods of home? Could men accustomed to bread and beef endure year after year on nothing but grease and dried meat? Or was this food only a temporary bridge, a survival tool that carried them through the Arctic but never across the gap between cultures? By the close of the 18th century, pemmican had moved from curiosity to necessity in Arctic travel. Expeditions that resisted it often faltered, those that embraced it endured. Yet its legacy is complicated. For pemmican carried with it not only the power of survival, but also the weight of dependence, pride, and uneasy memory. The most telling examples lie in contrasting outcomes. Crews that clung only to European rations, salted beef, biscuit, and vinegar, saw their men weaken quickly. Journals record scurvy spreading, strength failing, and morale collapsing. Some men starved outright when their provisions spoiled. By contrast, expeditions that accepted pemmican from Inuit or Cree allies often lasted far longer. Men who ate it marched across ice, hauled sledges, and survived winters with greater strength. In some cases, the difference was measured in lives. Dozens lost in one voyage, dozens saved in another, the variable not being courage or leadership, but diet. The efficiency of pemmican impressed even the most sceptical officers. One explorer wrote with grudging admiration, "A small bag, weighing little more than 2 stone, will feed 10 men for near a fortnight." Others noted that it travelled better than beef, resisted spoilage better than biscuit, and fueled labour more effectively than any other ration. These observations reshaped planning. By the early 19th century, pemmican was no longer an emergency supply but a staple of Arctic expeditions, demanded in large quantities before voyages departed. But the embrace of pemmican did not erase cultural tensions. For Europeans, survival foods carried symbolic weight. Bread, beef, and beer were tied to identity, to civilization, to the sense of carrying Europe into the wilderness. To depend on pemmican was to admit that European methods were insufficient, that indigenous knowledge was superior in this domain. Some officers acknowledged this openly, others concealed it, writing as if pemmican were their own discovery. The erasure of indigenous contributions in official reports stands as one of the quiet injustices of Arctic history. The men themselves, however, remembered differently. Sailors' journals speak candidly of the food that kept them alive. They record the greasiness, the heaviness, the monotony, but also the gratitude. One sailor wrote, "I owe my life to pemmican, though I would never eat it again if choice were mine." Another noted, "It is not pleasant, but it is life." Such words strip away the layers of pride and policy, leaving only the truth of lived experience, that pemmican worked. Its symbolic role grew larger as empires expanded. The Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company made pemmican their lifeblood, relying on it to feed voyageurs and traders across thousands of miles. Conflicts over its control culminated in the Pemmican War, underscoring how a food born of indigenous practice had become the cornerstone of European commerce in the north. For Arctic expeditions, this shift meant that pemmican could be acquired more readily, but it also meant that its cultural meaning was entangled with the politics of empire. Inuit memory preserved a different perspective. For them, pemmican and similar foods were not exotic or symbolic, but ordinary, part of a rhythm of survival honed over centuries. They watched Europeans struggle with pride, sickness, and death, offering food that was accepted sometimes with gratitude, sometimes with hesitation. Oral histories recall these encounters with a mixture of sympathy and bemusement, a reminder that for indigenous communities survival was not heroic but habitual. The legacy of pemmican, then, lies in the tension between habit and crisis. For the Inuit and Cree, it was daily bread. For Europeans, it was emergency food, remembered not with fondness, but with ambivalence. Yet history reveals its power. Pemmican was one of the few foods capable of bridging the gap between human need and Arctic reality. Without it, many expeditions would never have returned. Today, when we read the journals of Arctic explorers, pemmican stands out not for its flavour but for its function. It is described as heavy, greasy, monotonous, but also sustaining, reliable, and indispensable. It is remembered with reluctance, yet also with reverence. In the story of exploration, it is both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary for those who created it, extraordinary for those who borrowed it. And so the question lingers, echoing through history. When survival depends on borrowing from another culture, does the memory of that dependence endure as gratitude or as discomfort? For Arctic explorers, the answer was both. Pemmican became their salvation, but also their unease, a reminder that in the frozen north, Europe did not conquer alone, but endured only by eating the wisdom of others. In the ship's coldest corners, butter hardened like stone, each block a frozen treasure waiting to soften under fire's fragile warmth. When 18th century expeditions set sail for the Arctic, they did not think only of meat, biscuit, and beer. They also carried with them the quieter comforts of Europe: barrels of cheese, casks of butter, and sometimes even milk reduced to curd or powder. These were not luxuries. Alone, they were seen as essential for balance in the diet, providing fat, protein, and variety. Yet the Arctic transformed these provisions into burdens, reshaping their role from food to symbol, from sustenance to struggle. Butter was the most common dairy sent to sea. Packed into wooden firkins or barrels, salted heavily to delay spoilage, it was meant to last for months. In the temperate holds of a ship, butter might grow rancid, leaking grease and smelling foul. In the Arctic, however, the problem was the opposite. It froze solid. Sailors joked that their butter had become stone, unyielding to knife or spoon. To cut it required an axe, to eat it required patience, for it had to be thawed near a fire before spreading. What had been soft and pliable at home became, in the Arctic, another obstacle to daily meals. Cheese, too, was carried in abundance. Hard cheeses, aged for months, survived longest, while soft varieties spoiled quickly. Stored in barrels, they were distributed in weekly rations. Yet cheese, like butter, reacted strangely to the Arctic. The cold preserved it, but in preserving, it also transformed it. Cheeses grew brittle, their texture chalky. Some cracked apart when cut, others dried into husks that were barely chewable. Sailors gnawed them like bones, savouring what little flavour remained. Journals described cheese of stone-like hardness, another echo of butter's fate. For officers, these foods carried symbolic value. Cheese and butter were markers of Europe, reminders of farms, dairies, and the civilization they represented. To serve them, however altered, was to maintain a connection to home. Distribution was often careful, with portions measured precisely, both to prevent waste and to preserve morale. A small lump of butter to soften biscuit, a slice of cheese to flavour pea soup. These gestures offered psychological comfort, even when the food itself was far from pleasant. Yet problems arose quickly. Butter, even when salted, did not last indefinitely. Barrels sometimes split in the cold, grease seeping out and freezing in yellow sheets against the wood. When thawed, the butter tasted sour, its fat separated, its smell repulsive. Cheese, too, turned foul if moisture seeped into barrels, growing mould that flourished even in the cold. Sailors, desperate for variety, ate it anyway, scraping away mould and swallowing the rest. Complaints were frequent, but alternatives scarce. The daily rituals of butter and cheese reflected these struggles. In the galley, cooks thawed lumps of butter by the fire, spreading it over biscuit already crawling with weevils. Sailors ate, grateful for the hint of richness that masked insect crunch. Cheese was diced into soups, melting unevenly into greasy clumps, but adding a trace of flavour to endless salted beef. The foods were not plentiful, they were occasional additions, rare enough that men looked forward to them. Yet when barrels turned bad, disappointment cut deeply. To lose. Butter and cheese was to lose not only calories but a piece of home. Encounters with Inuit further sharpened the contrast. To indigenous peoples, dairy was foreign, unknown to their traditions. Their diets, rich in fat from animals, required no milk or butter. For sailors, the realization was humbling. What they considered essential was unnecessary in the Arctic. Butter turned to stone, cheese to chalk. Foods that meant survival in Europe meant burden in the north. Survival there required other knowledge, other foods. Yet still the barrels of butter and cheese sailed north, carried as symbols of empire and habit. In the quiet of Arctic nights, men ate what they could. Frozen lumps chipped with knives, foul butter scraped from barrels, brittle cheese softened in soup. They chewed, swallowed, and endured. And as they did, one question lingered. Could such foods, born of green pastures and warm barns, ever truly belong in a world of ice? On long Arctic voyages, butter and cheese were never abundant. They were expensive, heavy to transport, and fragile compared to salted meat or biscuit. For this reason, they were treated not as daily staples but as supplements, issued sparingly and often saved for special moments. A lump of butter, no larger than a walnut, might be given once or twice a week to soften biscuit. A wedge of cheese might appear every Sunday, marking the Sabbath as a day of modest indulgence. These gestures mattered far more than their caloric weight. They marked time, restored morale, and reminded men of home. The act of rationing dairy was deliberate and ceremonial. The purser opened barrels with care, prying frozen lids from firkins of butter or chiselling into wheels of cheese that had grown as hard as stone. The cook thawed what little he could near the galley fire, dividing portions with a precision that bordered on reverence. Each man received his share, measured to the ounce, no more, no less. Complaints were rare not because satisfaction was common, but because men knew that quarrels over such small luxuries could turn bitter quickly. For the sailors, these rations carried symbolic meaning. To taste butter on biscuit, even if rancid, was to recall bread at home spread thick with softness. To chew cheese, even when brittle and sour, was to remember taverns and hearths where food was plentiful. The taste was not pleasure alone, it was memory, and memory was as sustaining as calories. In journals, men often recorded their rations of butter and cheese with more detail than their daily beef. A pound of meat was ordinary, an ounce of butter was notable. Yet these foods also carried disappointment. Butter that thawed into sour grease, cheese that cracked with mould. Such rations felt like betrayal. Men looked forward to their distribution, only to recoil at their condition. One sailor described his portion as foul enough to make a dog sick. Another wrote that the cheese crumbled into dust and stank of damp. These words capture the double edge of dairy at sea. It could lift spirits, but when spoiled, it deepened despair. The officers knew this well. Some, understanding morale, saved their better stores for moments of crisis. A small cask of fresh butter might be held back until sickness spread, then issued as a restorative. A wheel of cheese might be saved for Christmas, creating a feast of sorts amid famine. Such gestures bound crews together, reminding them that though provisions were poor, care was still taken to preserve dignity. Others, less careful, squandered their stores early, leaving only disappointment for later months. The difference was felt keenly in the atmosphere of the ship. For Inuit and other northern peoples, the obsession with dairy seemed strange. They thrived without butter or cheese, their diets rich in animal fat and meat. When Europeans offered butter in trade, some accepted out of curiosity but did not seek it. To them it was unnecessary, even unpleasant. This contrast highlighted the cultural baggage of dairy. It was not survival food in the Arctic, but European food carried into the Arctic, a symbol of home more than a tool of endurance. Still, for the men of the expeditions, it mattered. The ritual of butter and cheese, however flawed, gave shape to time, provided variety, and offered fleeting comfort. It was more than nourishment, it was continuity. In the endless sameness of salted beef and biscuit, it reminded them of the world beyond ice. Yet the question lingered each time a barrel was opened. Would this ration be blessing or curse? Would the butter soften their meal or sour their stomachs? Would the cheese restore cheer or spread disappointment? Each ration carried not only calories but suspense, shaping morale 1 ounce at a time. By the late 18th century, the presence of butter and cheese on Arctic voyages was less a question of nutrition than of habit. They were provisions of Europe, carried northward as symbols of continuity, tokens of civilization against the encroaching wilderness. Yet the Arctic was indifferent to these tokens. It froze them, soured them, and stripped them of their intended comfort. In doing so, it transformed them into metaphors for the difficulty of carrying Europe into a world that resisted it. Some expeditions recorded success. Butter, when kept salted and sealed, sometimes lasted for months without spoiling. When thawed carefully, it softened biscuit and lifted morale. Cheese, when dry and aged, endured even longer, offering variety in soups and stews. On such voyages, men spoke gratefully of these rations, noting how they broke the monotony and restored energy. The foods may have been altered by cold, but they still carried meaning. Other voyages, however, remembered butter and cheese only as disappointments. Butter froze into lumps so solid that knives bent against them, then thawed into foul-smelling grease. Cheese cracked apart, its texture ruined, its flavour turned to bitterness. Men wrote of throwing portions overboard, unable to stomach them even in hunger. The waste itself deepened despair. To discard food in the Arctic was to admit defeat, to confess that what had been carried so far was useless in the place it was most needed. The contrast between usefulness and futility made butter and cheese powerful symbols. To eat them successfully was to maintain a fragile connection to home. To see them spoil was to feel the Arctic's triumph over human planning. Officers who noted butter turned to stone in their logs were not only recording a culinary inconvenience, they were recording the collapse of expectation, the futility of imposing European habits on an environment that did not permit them. And yet, memory softened the bitterness. Sailors who survived sometimes recalled butter and cheese with humour. They told stories of chiselling at frozen lumps, of butter so hard it cracked the table, of cheese so brittle it shattered into crumbs. These anecdotes, retold in taverns and homes, became part of the folklore of exploration. Hardship, once endured, turned into jest. Butter turned to stone became shorthand for the absurdities of Arctic life, a phrase that carried both laughter and truth. In archaeological remains, traces of dairy are rare but telling. Excavated firkins have been found with greasy residues, evidence of butter once stored and lost. Fragments of cheese rind occasionally appear, hardened like bone. These remnants, unimpressive in themselves, speak of the broader story. The stubbornness of carrying fragile foods into hostile places, and the determination to cling to symbols of home even when they failed. The symbolic role of dairy extended into naval memory. Butter and cheese were not central to survival. Meat, fat and biscuit carried the real burden. Yet butter and cheese mark the human need for variety, comfort and continuity. They represented the refusal to surrender entirely to the Arctic, even when surrender might have been practical. In this sense, they became metaphors for the expeditions themselves, heavy, fragile, sometimes futile, yet carried onward in defiance of reason. To modernise, the story may seem trivial. Why dwell on butter and cheese when storms, ice and scurvy claimed lives? Yet for the men who lived it, these foods mattered. They shaped morale, defined rituals and coloured memory. To taste butter on a frozen biscuit was to taste civilization. To chew rancid cheese was to taste defeat. In small ways, these foods carried the weight of empire and the fragility of survival. So the image endures, butter turned to stone in sub-zero holds, cheese cracking like chalk in the cold. They remind us that survival in the Arctic was not only about endurance but about adaptation, and about the cost of refusing to adapt. And so, one final question lingers. Was the persistence of carrying butter and cheese northward an act of courage, of stubbornness, or of futility? History does not answer. It only records the taste of butter frozen like rock, eaten in silence by men who dreamed of softer loaves and warmer hearths far from the ice.